Welcome to Two Trick Pony, a twice-monthly podcast where we explore all the ways that people have found and cultivated their second tricks, from lutherie to loom weaving and everything in between. We're your hosts. I'm Melissa Betters.
And I'm Clara Ma, and we thank you for joining us. Each week, we invite guests onto the show who have broken away from the expectations of their training, education, or CV to find fulfilling hobbies or even entirely new careers.
We take a look at how cultivating a multifaceted self can lead you to community, connection, and confidence.
This week, we're joined by John C.L. Jansen, a composer, multi-instrumentalist, experimental luthier, author, recording engineer, and educator of music technology and music theory. He's currently pursuing his PhD in music composition, and he teaches composition at the university level. He's been kind enough to let us call him a two-trick pony when he's probably more like a seven-trick one.
Today, we're going to focus mostly on one of his tricks, the art of instrument making, or also known more formally as lutherie. So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about the history and art of making musical instruments.
What you're hearing is music using an instrument that John made. Lutherie, which comes from a French word meaning lute, like the instrument, is the fancy word for making and repairing instruments, usually bowed and plucked stringed instruments like the violin, cello, and guitar. In John's case, he builds traditional guitars, but he also makes more experimental instruments, including those that don't have strings. What you just heard is a daxophone that he crafted out of wood and that can be played with a bow.
What's a daxophone, you might ask? Never fear. Keep listening.
Music is universal, and people have made instruments since the ancient civilizations. Many of the musical instruments that you have heard had their origins as experiments, though the very origins of musical instruments is still a topic of great scholarly debate.
From ancient drums used in rituals to Tibetan bells to modern experimental instruments, like the ones we'll hear about from John, humans have been creating ways to make and control sounds throughout human history. The history of musical instrument making is truly fascinating, and studying it can give us a glimpse of how cultures interacted, as well as global trade relations. We can only hint at the rich history here.
Before the 16th century, instruments and the playing of them were largely ceremonial or used in official settings. As more people learned to play instruments in the 16th century in Europe, an industry for instrument making emerged. These artisans became known by their names. For instance, Antonio Stradivari became synonymous with the finest stringed instruments. These artisans formed instrument maker guilds in Europe, the Middle East, and in South and East Asia.
These artisans were strongly influential in the development of instruments. They decorated their craftsmanship, but they also introduced innovative designs and even created new instruments in response to composers and musicians. For instance, Richard Wagner commissioned Adolf Sax, the inventor of the saxophone, to make him a new type of tuba for his famous epic opera, The Ring.
I have to jump in here and talk a little bit about the piano, my personal favorite instrument. Pianos were also once experimental instruments. Melissa and I were recently in Italy, and we saw some of these historical precursors in the instrument collection at the Accademia in Florence. An early form of the piano, called the spinet, was an instrument that used a key-based mechanism instead of fingers to pluck the strings, similar to but smaller than the harpsichord. It was made in part to protect young ladies' fingernails from being ruined by plucking strings.
Can you imagine the horror?
Well, pianists now can be thankful that someone cared enough about our fingernails to create a whole new instrument for them.
Today, musicians, composers, and instrument makers are still dreaming up new ways to make sounds. You'll hear from John about his inspirations in experimental music making, including Glenn Branca, an American avant-garde guitarist, composer, and instrument maker who was highly influential in the 1970s and 1980s New York experimental music scene.
Making musical instruments is a rare craft, so we're really excited for you to hear today's episode. Let's turn now to our conversation with our guest today, musician and instrument maker John C.L. Jansen, calling in from Washington, D.C.
Welcome, John Jansen, to Two Trick Pony Podcast. We're so excited to have you on today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So for our listeners, John, can you give a brief introduction of who you are and what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, well, my name's John Jansen. I'm primarily a composer. I have a background in more traditional classical music. I think when I first started, I was playing classical guitar, more sort of classical period repertoire. And at a certain point during my master's, I got into instrument building and I started integrating instruments and sort of woodworking into my compositions. And at this point, I think I have sort of a hybrid approach. I build instruments with the idea to include them in music that I'm composing.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because a lot of people play instruments, but not a lot of people make the instruments that they are playing. So you said you sort of started getting into this during your master's. Can you talk a little bit more about that moment when you first decided to try and make the instruments that you were going to try and play?
Yeah, I think if I even back up a little bit, when I first started playing guitar, I was inspired by people like Brian May, the guitarist from Queen. He had built his own guitar with the help of his dad. They built a guitar out of a mantelpiece, basically. And I was really inspired by that when I picked up guitar. I kind of wanted to, be like Brian May. It's sort of like the guitar hero thing when you're younger. And it was later on when I started getting more into what we'd call chamber music, or music written for classical instruments to be played in a concert hall. I heard a concert by someone named Mark Stewart. He has a group called the Orchestra of Original Instruments. And I guess I just had never thought that you could build your own instrument and include it in an ensemble with other, we could say real instruments or already existing instruments. And that kind of led me down a path of just discovering other people that had been doing this. And I thought, I want to do that. It was something, like I said, I had always been interested in. So that kind of led me to a place where I started accumulating tools, and I wanted to, I guess, create things that would allow me to execute musical ideas that I couldn't execute with instruments that were already standard.
So you mentioned some of the inspirations that made you start thinking about building instruments. What were resources that you found that were really helpful? Since building instruments requires a lot of different skills, right? There's the woodworking aspect of it. But there's also the ability to be able to actually play them and think about what they look like. And there's all the craftsmanship that goes along with it.
Yeah, I think there are many layers to that. It's just continued to grow. When I first started out, again, I was working with a really small number of tools and kind of a smaller amount of space. And most of the things that I used to learn were books. I started accumulating books, YouTube videos. So I found videos and books by woodworkers, books and videos by instrument builders, and I just started gathering as many resources as I could find. So I think I did one initial trip to Home Depot, and I got maybe $100 worth of tools, and I just used a room in my apartment, and it was just very primitive, I guess, in terms of the resources that I had in the beginning. I just didn't have, now I have a fully featured wood shop, and it kind of grew over time. But I think space is a big consideration. You need a lot of space and just number of tools too. Like I said in the beginning, I didn't have a lot, but as I accumulated more work and more space, I was able to expand that.
So I'm particularly interested in, and I think our listeners will also be interested in hearing a bit about what instruments you've actually made. I, for one, would have absolutely no idea where to even start. So what types of things are you actually building?
That's a good question. It's so there's a few different types. The first instruments that I made they're called harmonics guitars, and they're basically large zithers, and they're 2x4s that have strings mounted on the 2x4. And it was actually invented by a composer named Glenn Branca, who was involved in the sort of New York City new music scene or contemporary classical music scene in the 1980s. And I had found plans for how to build the instrument. So it's actually me and my dad built the first harmonics guitar that I created in my parents' garage. That was a pre-existing instrument, but that led me to create more. I created a new version of that instrument it's actually 9 feet long with just a couple of strings mounted on it, and you get sort of an incredible amount of resonance from that instrument. And that was kind of my initial foray into instrument building. Now, like these days, I'm making electric guitars, like solid body electric guitars. And I also it's a type of percussion instrument called a daxophone.
So for our listeners, we're going to play a clip of what a daxophone sounds like.
And it's a bowed, like the technical term for it is it's a bowed friction idiophone, which means it's like the object itself is what generates the sound. The wood is what generates the sound. You play it with a bow, and it sounds a little bit vocal. It sounds maybe a little bit like a wind instrument in some registers, but it's a really interesting instrument that I think is capable of unique musical ideas. And I think that's kind of the main thing that led me to want to do this, is to create instruments that could do something unique.
One of the things that we're interested in people talking about a little bit on the podcast are the types of constraints that people deal with when trying to pursue their hobby, or when trying to pursue, in your case, this is really a big part of your profession as a musician and as a musical instrument maker. Can you talk a little bit about how did you deal with those constraints?
It's a great question. I think in the beginning it was just difficult to navigate because I had to figure out what instruments I had the resources to create, and I had ideas for other instruments that I just couldn't make. Like I was really interested in making certain types of electric guitars, for example, and I just didn't have the space to have the tools necessary to create the instruments. And so I started small, I guess. I know the instruments were kind of large, but the building techniques were simple, and I was able to create them with kind of a minimum of materials. So I think I just sort of had to use whatever resources I had access to, and specifically with the harmonics guitars and the giant zithers. At that time, I was connected to the electronic music studio at the school that I was working for. So I actually was able to store them there, because storage is a concern for those instruments in particular. But they kind of became part of the studio there. But yeah, I think space is definitely a big thing. I think more from like a composition standpoint, a big thing, like if you're a composer, is you might write a string quartet and then you try to market that string quartet to a lot of different groups to try and get performances. And with the kind of original instrument aesthetic, just by nature, you're going to get less performances. So I think you have to be okay with that. And also, that's a big limitation, right? Or it could be an advantage. So you kind of need a specific person in order to make that happen.
I'm curious about that. For instance, with the daxophone, are there other people who know how to play these instruments? Or do you also teach people how to play them? Especially if you're coming up with new types of instruments for people to play, how do you get those into other people's hands and have them experiment and play with them as well?
It's a mix of different things. I think with the daxophone, it was actually invented by someone named Hans Reichel, who invented it in the 1980s, and he passed away in the 2010s. And me and I think there are two or three other builders have kind of tried to pick up the flag and keep the instrument alive. With any new instrument, even going back a little bit further with like the theremin or the Ondes Martinu, you need a community of people to keep the instrument alive. Like you need people that know how to play it, kind of like you're saying. You need people that know how to repair it to kind of keep it alive. So with instruments that are new, they can be a little bit vulnerable to disappearing if people don't try to keep it around. But I think with some of the stuff that I create, yeah, I try to teach people how to play it. Like when I perform, often people come up to me after the concert and they want to check out the instrument. They want to learn how to play it. Certainly, if someone, again, at a certain point, I turned this into a business where I'm selling some of the things that I make and selling replicas of like the Hans Reichel instruments. But I Zoom call with people sometimes, and I'll give like a lesson on how to play the instrument. There are YouTube videos. Definitely a big issue, though, is, maybe you need to start writing manuals for how to play each instrument or something along those lines.
Yeah, that could be helpful for sure.
Technical writing for instruments.
Yeah.
Yes. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about the moment that you sort of mentioned is the decision to actually sell the instruments that you were making. You make some really beautiful, like guitar necks and things like that. What went into the decision to actually like sell the things that you were making?
Yeah. So it sort of happened by accident. I never really got into it to try and monetize the instruments, but I guess it just sort of happened. I had a friend that saw some of my posts on Facebook, and they were like, "Hey, can you make me one of those?" And I said, "Oh, okay." At that point, I didn't really think I was good enough at woodworking to be selling things, but I sort of just I went for it and started to slowly get more people that were writing me, and they were like, "Hey, could you make one of those for me?" And so then I put an ad online. I started an Etsy store and made some advertisements, and people started ordering things. So I just kind of slowly expanded, started with one sale and moved forward from there. But it's a tough question because I think the more time that I put into the business, it takes away from the art, like the time that I have to invest in the art side of it. So it's kind of tough always to weigh how much to put into one and, how is it going to affect my relationship with the other.
Yeah, no, that was going to be my next question was how does it affect your relationship with music? So I'm really glad you touched on that because I think that's really interesting.
I think that I've produced less of my own music in the last 5 years since the business has kind of taken over.
Yeah, just there is a trade-off there, and that's something that we explore in other conversations as well. So I'm glad that you talked a little bit about that. So for our listeners, what is something that you think people often misunderstand about making that transition from listening to music to actually creating it?
I think to create music, it's we're kind of just building things. I think it's not all that different from creating anything else. We're kind of just building things. I think as a listener, most people that listen to music, if you're a little bit critical, maybe you've heard a song and you've thought, oh, I might have done that a little bit differently, or I might have added an intro to that or something along those lines. You're really writing music. That's kind of all it is listening to something and being a little bit critical about it. And that can start as something very simple, right? You have a few chords on a guitar, you record that in and just think about, how could that be different? And then continue building it from there.
How would you characterize your style of music and your style of sort of composition? And can you take a second to talk about any musicians or composers that you may find particularly inspiring?
So I started out, I was listening to a lot of classical guitar music. So I think I was inspired by a lot of classical guitar composers. Aitor Villa-Lobos is a good example. Writing music kind of in the early 1900s. It's in what I describe as a kind of romantic style. And I, at a certain point, discovered what's called new music, and which is a very difficult term to define because there's always music that's new, right? But it generally refers to contemporary classical music of a certain style. So composers like Steve Reich, who's a minimalist composer from the New York City scene, was listening to a lot of Steve Reich. Glenn Branca, who I think I mentioned earlier, was also writing music with original instruments, but also he wrote these symphonies. He called them symphonies, but they were for big ensembles of electric guitars. It's super interesting. And Philip Glass also is very inspiring. And he's kind of has also been able to break into the film scoring world too. And so I think he's maybe a more well-known name. But I think my style is influenced a lot by that group of composers. So one thing is working with, they're called cells, which it's almost like, you can think of it like Legos. If you take one musical idea, whether it's a rhythm or a small melodic idea, like a couple of notes, then imagine those as Legos, kind of building a bigger composition.
Having heard some of your original compositions, the name that came to mind for me was Philip Glass. And so we'll play a little bit of your composition Fields of Jade for our listeners.
Yes, I wrote Fields of Jade during my master's program. It actually was originally for a different instrumentation. The recording that you just heard is for 2 baritone saxophones, marimba, and kick drum. So it's actually 3 performers. The marimba player is set up with a kick drum facing behind him, and so he plays the kick drum pedal with his heel, and then it's 2 baritone saxophone players. The original instrumentation was for 2 electric guitars and marimba and kick drum. And I've actually made a few different versions of it. There's one that's just for saxophone ensemble. There are actually other movements too, but this one was the one that I think got the most plays. This piece was originally part of a set of pieces about different musical environments. Someone else I should have talked about is John Luther Adams, who has this idea of music as a place. So I wanted to create a sort of environment to exist in.
Interesting.
I guess one of the things I wanted to ask also is that my understanding is that you also teach composition and that you're working towards a more academic composition career. Can you talk a little bit more about how you approach teaching composition when you're describing the cells? I'm picturing it in my head a bit. And as someone who has a classical music background, I grew up playing the piano. I have some idea of what you're saying, but I'm thinking about for students who are coming to you, what's like the lesson that you want them to walk away with?
I think, so like a day one lesson with someone, I usually talk about pre-composition and planning. And so I teach how to do a pre-composition sketch where you're almost making, it's like an architecture analog, where it's like you're making a sketch of the layout of the building or the composition. So you're kind of making decisions about the piece in advance. Could be things like key, feeling, meter, types of rhythms, if there are cells, what are some of them, number of minutes, so duration, tempo, kind of dividing or thinking about every possible most important musical parameter and then making a list of them and then kind of translating that to a drawing. So I usually go like minute by minute with people. You can chart out the form and slowly kind of build out details. So at a certain point, it's almost like you're just dropping in notes once you've made a larger plan.
Is there any moment throughout your composition career, your music career, your, making instruments career, is there any moment where you felt especially proud or excited about what you were doing?
As an instrument builder, I think there are 2 important moments that I'm really proud of. One was back in 2017. I was part of a project that got to restore a bunch of the original Glenn Branca instruments for a new music organization called Bang on a Can. So I kind of meant a lot to me to be able to work with some of Glenn's original instruments and see them on stage being used. And then another is more recent. I worked for a composer named Abel Kojanovsky. And I made some custom instruments for him and that he used on the score of a movie called The Watchers, which I don't think it's on Netflix anymore, but it was in theaters and went to streaming services, and it was just a really incredible thing to be part of, I think.
Yeah, that's really cool. I was going to ask you because when I was listening to some of your compositions, they are very evocative, and in some ways, I don't know if you've gotten this before, there are some of your pieces that remind me of Princess Mononoke.
Oh, that's one of That's one of my favorite movies, actually. So that's awesome.
Yeah, you can hear it in some of the pieces you have that, there's that like forest spirit kind of motif that comes through in some of them. I'm really curious, since you mentioned that your musical instruments have been used in a film, whether that is one of your goals, to have music that you've written or instruments that you've created to be used in scoring films or in accompanying other media.
Absolutely. It's something I would like to break into. Most of my experience is in more of the concert music world, but I would really like to break into film scoring as well. But I also am interested in, I would love to just perform on new instruments for film scores as well. In history, there's a couple people, like there's someone that I'm forgetting his name, but he played an instrument called the blaster beam. It was like on all of the early sci-fi movies. He was making like the low rumbly sound of starships and things like that. So I would love to get that gig, like to be the person that plays instruments like that on a film score. I think that would be a cool job.
That's reminding me of, I can't remember what the instrument is called, but it's like the Armenian like flute.
The duduk.
The duduk, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. There's a duduk performer you can hear him playing on a lot of scores. I think he plays on like Gladiator and stuff like that.
Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say something about the Game of Thrones theme. It's the opening. Like it sounds like a cello. It's actually a fretted instrument that was made specifically for the theme.
Oh, that's so interesting. I would not have known that. Yeah, right. There is a market then for these unique instruments, and especially I think for like fantasy. Mm-hmm. It makes sense that there are other instruments that would be used. It also makes me think of we were like recently watching Andor, the Star Wars series. There's a scene where there's like a marching band playing for a funeral, and all of the instruments are I think they're like adapted actual instruments that are made to look kind of sci-fi-y, but there may be also instruments in there that are created kind of from scratch.
Yeah, now I remember that scene, and I wish I had looked into it more because I don't know if they were like new instruments that were invented for the score, or if they were just sort of fleshing out the culture of that planet with sort of imaginary instruments. But it's very cool either way.
I'm going to ask a question actually going back a little bit, which is when you first started putting your music out there, how did that feel? I know for a lot of artists that can be a bit of a daunting moment because this is something that's really personal, right? A lot of times art is a reflection of your own personal story or your challenges that you've faced and things like that. It's a very personal thing to put out to the public. Can you think about the moment when you decided that you wanted to share your work?
Yeah, it was scary. It was a really scary thing to do. I think it gets easier the more that you do it. But I think initially I was like, does anyone want to hear this? Would anyone really think this is good? I don't really know. And you just gain confidence over time. And I think the first thing I ever put online was probably on SoundCloud. And I put something I just made in a DAW, a digital audio workstation, and just put it up on SoundCloud. And, maybe it got a 50 plays or something. I got to a point in my composition where I was starting to sell scores. Like people were contacting me and being like, hey, I want to play this. And I would sell the score. And then I remember joining a Zoom call where I was watching someone play my piece on stage. And I was like, wow, this is a weird experience, but weird but good, I guess.
That must have been a really interesting moment. What do you think that music brings to people's lives, and why do you think it's important for people to potentially delve deeper into the relationship that they have with music?
I think music ultimately is about serving others. So I think music is a service to everyone. So I actually think that's one of the highest callings of being a musician and being able to perform, is that you're really serving others.
I love that. I didn't expect that answer. I love that. So before we let you go, where can people find you and your work?
A few different places. I have an Instagram where you can find a lot of my instrument building, and that's JLJ Instruments. I think that's probably the best place. I also have a Bandcamp page where you can find some of my music. And I also have a website online right now. That's johnjansenmusic.com. That's where a lot of my music lives, and that's where you can find like score samples and things like that.
Great. So we'd like to close out the interview with just a few quick rapid fire questions. So these are sort of short questions, short answers. So the first question, what is your favorite instrument?
Electric guitar or viola, one of those two.
Name one tool that you use that you are unreasonably and emotionally attached to.
That's a good question. Definitely I have a number 7 jointer plane that I use on almost every instrument, or definitely every instrument, actually. I use it every day. And it's a plane that's used to flatten a piece of wood. Creates a perfect surface for gluing and creates a perfect joint. And I use it probably multiple times a day.
What would be the ultimate gift to buy somebody who's into instrument making?
Probably books. Any kind of book on how to make a certain type of instrument.
Can you share a fun fact about the art of making instruments?
It requires a lot of patience.
What's the next thing that you'd like to learn in your field?
I would like to learn how to make classical guitars.
And finally, do you have any last words of wisdom you'd like to share?
I would say just don't be afraid to get into making instruments. I think it's very easy to go to Home Depot and get some pretty simple tools and simple materials. In fact, I actually advise you just go to Home Depot with something like a cello bow or a violin bow and start bowing different materials and see what sounds they make. Because there's a lot of instruments you can make with very simple materials. So I would say if it's something you're interested in, just kind of dive in and start making things.
So thank you so much, John, for coming onto Two Trick Pony. This was really fascinating. And as someone who's played music but has clearly never made any instruments or really thought about the complexity of all of the instruments that you could make that are new, I only played classical instruments. This is really, really interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk more about your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk. This was really fun.
Listeners, thank you so much for tuning in this week. Stick around till the end of the episode to hear one of John's original compositions.
If you want to get in touch with us, or if you know a Two Trick Pony who would be a great fit for the show, please let us know by email at twotrickponypodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at Two Trick Pony Podcast. Those are both with the number 2.
If you liked this podcast, please rate us and subscribe so you never miss an episode. We will be back for our next episode in 2 weeks. Now, to close us out, please enjoy the song A Very Brief Fable by John Jansen.